In this video, we're going to talk about a set of interactive elements in HTML. Now, these are relatively new elements to HTML, and as such, you won't see them used around the web too much already. Mostly when people are achieving similar things, they're going to be using fancier JavaScript based or more intensive CSS solutions to do the sorts of things that we're going to do here. But the first set of elements that I want to look at is called details and summary. This is a pair of elements that goes together. So let's see what happens if I just create a details and summary pairing. Details element. Inside of that element, I'm going to add a summary. As the name implies for the summary, I can just write something really short here. Let's say, look inside. And then inside the rest of the details element, I'm just going to add a little bit of text. Peekaboo. Okay, let's save it and see what it looks like in the browser. Okay, I just have this little thing that says look inside, and you can see that there's a little arrow on the left. I'm actually just going to jump quickly back into my CSS and clear out some of these default styles. So let's see what happens when we look in the browser. We just have this little bit of text that says look inside and a little arrow. We don't see our peekaboo text. Let's see what happens when we click on the summary. The peekaboo appears and the arrow toggles down. So what the details and summary element is basically a little openable drawer or an accordion. And we can put anything we want in the summary or in the details. These look pretty basic. We might want to do a little bit more to make this work a little bit better. Now, of course, you could have various elements inside of the details. So an H2 and maybe a paragraph. And now if we look at it in the browser, we can see that those elements are going to behave as you would expect. But this is all you have to do to make the details and summary elements work. You just put whatever you want to be always visible inside the summary. That's basically the teaser text. And then everything else just goes inside the details, but outside of the summary. I think it's a pretty good practice to have an element that you use to wrap all the content of the drawer when it opens. So I'm just going to suggest using a div for that at all times. And the reason for this is that if you're styling your details and summary pairing, this gives you a way to style the inner contents all as a group. So I suggest using a div. Now let's just see what we can do if we apply a little bit of style. So I can go in here and I can select for summary. And maybe I'm going to add a little padding and maybe a background color. I'll just do a light blue. If we look at this in the browser again, we get something that's looking a little bit more like you might expect an accordion to look. And now, because I have added that div as a container for the inner contents of the details, I can select for that specifically. And by doing so, it gives me something with which I can style sort of the interior of that drawer. So I could give it a background color, and we can say ghost white, and we'll give it a little padding as well. And again, let's take a look. Here we go. So now we're getting some real style, and we're styling our details and summary however we want to. Now, it's important to know about details and summary that though I referred to as an accordion, it doesn't necessarily work exactly like you might expect an accordion to work, in that they're not mutually exclusive to have them open. So if I make a second one and we try these out in the browser, you can see that they can both be opened at once. Opening one does not automatically close the other. So that's just something to be aware of. Now, the final thing I want to talk about as far as styling these goes is the little caret here, or open and closed indicator. So if we go back into our style, we have a way that we can select for that. Once this is fully supported in all browsers, you'll be able to use the list style image property to style this. So if I were to just go ahead and throw in an image URL, in the future, this is going to be supported in all browsers, and that will be enough to change that caret. But as I said, this is a fairly new element, and so this is not fully supported in all browsers, and you can see that's not working right now. So we have another way that we can select for this for the time being in Chrome and related browsers. It is this summary dash WebKit details marker. Summary WebKit details marker. And we can put in the image as a background image. And we can use color transparent to hide the existing marker. So you see we get this arrow image. But since we've added a custom image, you can see that it doesn't turn when we open it. Now, there's a few different ways to approach dealing with this, but the most important thing to know is that we need to be able to select the summary when it is open. So we can do something like this: details, and then square brackets, and inside of that, open. Because behind the scenes, whenever the details is opened, then it gets an attribute on it. And placing an attribute in the square brackets is the way we can select by an attribute. So now I can make a child selector for the summary WebKit details marker. So this means the WebKit details marker on a summary inside a details that has the open attribute. That's what this selector means. And then I can paste in another separate background image that points downward. And now you see I get the downward arrow when it's open, and it goes back to the sideways arrow when it's closed. So that is using this selector, which seems a little complex, but all it means is we're targeting the details marker on the summary in the details element when it is open, when it has that open attribute. And then we're loading a different image, this down arrow instead of this right arrow. So that's details and summary. That's just a real quick crash course. And there's a lot of things you can do in terms of styling and getting creative with it. The other interactive element that I want to talk about today is the dialogue element. A dialogue is like a modal pop up, sometimes called a light box. And we can put anything we want in this dialogue. So I can put H3 and some text, and maybe we'll put a paragraph. Okay, and so we have that in this dialogue. Let's see what happens in the browser. Well, we don't see anything, and that's because by default, a dialogue is hidden. So we're going to need a way to show this. And the way to do this is by adding a button and then creating a little bit of code that's going to cause that button to open the dialog. So I'm just going to add a little button code here. So I've got a button with an ID of modal and a type of button. When you put type button on button, it means that this button is used to do something with JavaScript. It's not for submitting a form. If we didn't have type button, it would look for a form to submit. And then we put the text open modal. So here's our button. We don't have any margin, so it's kind of squeezed up against our details and summary. But when we click it, nothing happens. And that's because we haven't wired up the button to the dialog. This is the only time in these lessons that I'm going to throw a little bit of JavaScript out. And I'm not going to go really into what the JavaScript is doing or how it's set up. I just want to throw this JavaScript out as a way to wire these things together. So I'm just going to paste this in here. You can see it's in a script tag, which basically just means, hey, here's a little bit of JavaScript. Okay, so basically what this JavaScript is looking for is when this button is clicked, it's going to look for the dialog and it's going to open it. Let's give things a try now. So when I save things, open the modal, and there's the dialog. And you see the dialog has this very minimal default style. It'll show anything that we want it to, but the styles are very minimal. It has this little black border, and there's a little bit of a graying out effect on the background. And with the JavaScript that we set up, it'll just close the modal anytime I click outside of it. So that's this JavaScript here. If you want to use the JavaScript directly from the video, you can pause the video and copy and paste it out. But all it's doing is just telling this button to open the dialog and then saying when we click outside of the dialog, close the dialog again. And again, we can style this dialog any way we want to. I can go dialog and I can give it a different border, something like this. We can give it rounded corners. We could make it bigger, give it more padding, give it a different background color, anything we can think of. Another cool thing we can do is we can style the background, that backdrop, that grayed out area. So if I bring in a new selector, and this selector is a custom selector that's just for the situation, it's dialog : backdrop. So that's targeting that backdrop to the dialog. And I can do anything I want. I can give it a background color, and maybe I'll use RGBA so that we have a little bit of transparency. I'll do 0, 0, 0. So that's black, comma, 0.6. So that's a little bit of transparency. And now when I Cause this to work. It opens and we can see we have a darker background because that's what I've added here. I could do a color. I could throw in a background image and give it some kind of pattern or image background. I could do anything I wanted with it. And then finally, the other interesting thing that we can do with the dialogue, and we could also do this with the details when it opens, is select for the open state. So it's that same attribute selector that we used on the details, dialogue, square brackets, open, and we can do anything we want when it opens. And an interesting thing to do with this is do a little bit of animation. Now, we're not going to get into animation in this video, but if I had an animation set up, I could cause it to be triggered when the dialogue is opened by that button. So I could use my animation name and a timing function and whatever I wanted to, and then that animation would trigger to animate the dialogue in. I'm not going to go into that now. I just wanted to point out that it is possible. Again, just to review, we have learned about 3 new elements here. We have learned about the details and summary pairing. The summary shows, and none of the rest of the contents of the details show until the summary has been clicked on. And then it opens up like a drawer and shows you the rest of the contents of the details element. You can style this by selecting for the summary and selecting for the details. You can use a div or another container of your choice to hold everything that's inside the details so that you can style that area specifically. You can select the marker that goes with the details element by using summary dash WebKit details marker. And you can use a background image to show as custom image for that marker. And you can use color transparent to hide the existing marker. And you can change that marker when the details is opened by using this selector here, summary WebKit details marker, which is inside of details bracket open, which means an attribute of open, and change that image. And then we learned about the dialog element, which is a pop-up modal dialog. It by default does not show, it's hidden, but you can use a button and a little bit of JavaScript to tie that button to it to open it up when the button is clicked. And we can do a lot of fun stuff using CSS for this. We can change the appearance of the dialog itself any way we want to. We can use dialog backdrop to style that backdrop that covers the existing material on the web page. And then we can use the dialog open attribute selector to apply an animation that gets triggered when the dialog is opened.